They ordered pizza and ate it in the car. While I was inside, lighting candles under a roast he taught me to make, I could hear their laughter from the driveway, muffled and distant. My son had come all the way from Connecticut with his family, promising that we'd celebrate Harold's birthday the way we always did, just like before. But somewhere along the line, something had shifted, and it wasn't the house, the one we'd built together, or even the years that had passed since Harold died. It was something about how my son had started to see me, or rather, how he no longer saw me at all. At first, I told myself it was just a passing phase, that maybe it was a result of his busy life, the pressures of being a father and a husband. But with each passing visit, it became clearer. I wasn't a part of his life anymore. I was an inconvenience, a relic from his past that he had to deal with, but never really see. I'm 78 now. Harold would have been 82 today. He's been gone for 14 years. But every year, on this day, I try to recreate the meals we once shared in the kitchen. It's my way of keeping him alive, of holding on to the fragments of what we had. It's funny how grief works. People think it gets easier with time, but they don't tell you that it just becomes something you live with. You don't forget, you don't let go, but you learn how to keep going with the weight of it in your chest. And so I've kept the tradition going, even after Harold was no longer here to enjoy it. This dinner, the lamb roast, the peach cobbler, it was for me as much as it was for him. It was my way of remembering who I was, of remembering that I was someone who could still cook, still care, still do for others. It was my way of saying, I'm still here. I had spent the whole morning in the kitchen, just like I always did. The smells filled the house, the earthy rosemary from the lamb, the buttery creaminess of the potatoes, the sweetness of the peaches as they softened in the oven. I knew every scent, every sound, the sizzle of the lamb as it roasted, the soft hum of the oven. Harold used to sit in the living room, reading the paper while I cooked, always saying that the smell of good food was the only thing that truly made a house feel like home. But today, the house felt emptier than it had in years. There was no Harold to share the evening with, no laughter or banter from the man I had spent more than half of my life with. And there was no one else who truly appreciated what I was doing. My son, Daniel, had called early in the day to let me know they were on their way. It was all so perfunctory, like a business transaction. No, how are you, Mom? Or, it's been a while. Just, we'll be there around 4. Don't worry about anything, Mom. I did worry. I worried every year, as I always had. But I didn't say it. I didn't need to. When they arrived, I was ready. The table was set with the best china, the one I only ever brought out for special occasions. It was a simple table. Nothing extravagant, just some candles and the food, of course. I had even put Harold's picture in the center, just like we always did. His smile, frozen in time. But when they arrived, something felt wrong immediately. They didn't step inside. They lingered by the door, looking at each other, then at me. And there was an awkwardness in the air that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't even about the meal anymore. It was about the way my son and his wife were looking at me, as if I were a stranger. The kids, their faces buried in their phones, barely glanced up to acknowledge me. No hello, no hug. It was as if they had arrived just to check off a box on some to-do list. Stay in the lounge, Grandma. We'll come back for you after check-in. My son's words were clipped, too patient, as if I were an inconvenience that needed to be managed. I nodded, of course, just as I always did. You don't argue when your son speaks to you like that. You don't question it. You just comply, because that's what you do when you've been a mother for decades. You serve, you step back, you disappear. It's not because you don't love them, but because you don't know any other way to exist. So, I stayed in the lounge, sat in the chair they'd motioned toward, the one that faced the dusty potted plant by the window. I watched the kids run off, not even glancing back to see if I was following. The television in the corner flickered, a weather channel running its endless loop, and I was left with my thoughts and the loneliness that always seemed to follow me around now. 8 hours passed. 8 hours. I waited for them to come back, just as they had promised. But they didn't. The lounge filled and emptied around me, people coming and going, travelling to their destinations, while I sat there, unnoticed. The chair beside me remained empty. I tried to ignore the creeping feeling in my chest, the one that told me something was terribly wrong. When I asked the clerk at the front desk to page my son, she looked at me with pity. Her eyes softened as she typed his name into the computer. A long pause followed. "They've already boarded," she said. "The flight to Honolulu left at 1:45. The words echoed in my ears, too loud, too sharp. "I'm sorry, Mom. There's nothing we can do." I wasn't surprised. I should have been, but I wasn't. I knew my son well enough. He wasn't careless, and this wasn't an accident. They had gone without me. Without a word, without a glance back. I walked to the restroom, locked myself inside a stall, and sat there, not crying. I didn't have the energy for that. I simply needed to sit where no one would ask if I was okay, where I wouldn't be judged for the quiet, hollow ache that was expanding inside me. I stayed there for a long time, watching the minutes tick by until I emerged and wandered back to the terminal, where the reality of it all settled in. They had left me behind, not because they didn't know, not because they didn't care, but because it was easier to forget, easier to pretend I wasn't there. I couldn't bring myself to face it, so I simply looked at the departure board. Portland, 7:35 p.m. I don't know why I chose Portland. Maybe because it was far enough from everything. Maybe because it was where I first learned to ride a bike, and for some reason, I needed to remember that woman, the one who had lived with hope, with love, with purpose. Maybe because it was the last place I could imagine them finding me. So, I walked to the counter, bought a one-way ticket to Portland, and left. No phone calls, no goodbyes, just a plane ticket and a decision. The woman behind the counter asked me if I was sure, and I told her I was. I didn't look back. And that was the moment everything changed. I sat by the window of the plane, watching the city lights grow dimmer as we ascended, my thoughts swirling just as the darkened landscape below blurred into shadows. The sound of the engines was a steady hum, a constant reminder that I was leaving behind everything I'd known, everything that had become familiar. And yet, I felt no sadness. Instead, I felt a strange, numbing calmness. A sense of inevitability that had been gnawing at me for months, years, perhaps. When the flight attendant passed by, her smile was kind, and I gave her a weak one in return, clutching the armrest of the seat as though that small gesture would somehow tether me to reality. The lights dimmed for the night, and I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to reflect. I wondered, as I often had over the years, where I went wrong. What had happened to me, to my relationship with Daniel, my son? How had it gotten to this point? The moment he stopped seeing me as his mother, as someone who once mattered in his life, had slowly turned into the moment I stopped seeing myself as his mother too. I had been relegated to the background, a supporting character in a family drama that no one ever let me star in. But tonight, as I watched the city fade beneath me, I realized that I had no choice but to let go. The people I had loved most, the ones I had given everything to, had already made their decisions. They had chosen their lives, their families, and their image over me. It was a cold, harsh truth, but it was the truth. Daniel and his family were better off without me around. They had been trying to squeeze me into a role I no longer fit. I had been pushed aside, ignored and abandoned, and yet I had allowed it, convinced that somehow, someday, they would remember who I was, that they would see me again as I had once been, as I had always wanted to be, loved, needed, seen. But that day never came. I remember the first time I saw it. The first time I truly understood that I had become invisible to my own son. It was during one of our Sunday dinners, the kind Harold used to insist on before he passed, the kind that felt important to me, even if they didn't seem to matter much to anyone else anymore. The meal was always the same. Roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, the smell filling the house in that familiar way that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I could still hold on to the past. Daniel and his wife, Carla, arrived late, as usual. The kids, glued to their phones, barely even looked up to greet me. We all sat at the table, and I tried to make conversation, as I always did, about the weather or what the kids were doing in school. But they barely responded. Carla, of course, was preoccupied with her phone, texting someone about a work event, and Daniel was too busy playing with his tablet to even notice the food on the table. That night, I felt something deep inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet, but a deep sense of shame. I tried not to show it, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I realized in that moment that my son wasn't just distant. He was uncomfortable. It wasn't that he didn't love me. I think he did, in his own way, but it was the way he looked at me now, like I was something he had outgrown, like I was someone who no longer fit into his new, polished life, a life where everything had to be perfectly curated, where the past had to be tucked away and forgotten. I wasn't a part of that life anymore, and he didn't need me to be. I wasn't the mother he once needed, the one who made him feel safe, loved, and important. I was just the woman who had given him life, and somewhere along the way, I had become irrelevant. That realization hit me harder than anything else. I wasn't mad at him. Not really. I was mad at myself for having let it go on for so long, for having accepted the crumbs of attention and affection, convincing myself that it was enough, that my son, the one I had given everything to, could be so easily swayed by his new family, his new life, his new values. Values that didn't include me. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about care. It was about convenience. It was easier for them to keep me at arm's length, easier to pretend I didn't need more. And I had let them do it. I let them forget the woman who had cooked for them every day, who had stayed up late to help them with their homework, who had comforted them when they were hurt, and who had always been there when they needed her. I had let them forget the woman who had once been the center of their world. I had let them replace me with their carefully constructed image of the perfect family, the perfect life. And in doing so, I had lost myself. But as the plane flew steadily through the night sky, I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this, hoping for a phone call, for a visit, for a moment of attention from the people I had spent so many years caring for. I couldn't keep waiting for them to finally notice me. It was time for me to step away. When the plane touched down in Portland, I didn't feel relief, or fear, or even the overwhelming sadness I had expected. I just felt empty. The city, so familiar yet so distant now, welcomed me back with open arms. I had been here before, long ago, before life had taken me in a different direction, before I became someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's grandmother. I had built a life here, just as I had built a life with Harold. But the life I had now was different. I wasn't sure where I belonged anymore. I didn't even know what I was looking for. I just knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. I walked out of the airport, the cool Portland air hitting me like a wave. It felt strange to be alone, to be free in a way that I hadn't felt in years. I had never traveled alone, not like this, not without a clear purpose, not without someone else to care for, someone else to think about. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was walking toward something. Not something I had planned, but something that felt right. I called a cab and gave the driver an address, not sure what I was expecting, but knowing I couldn't go back. Not yet. Not to that house in Wilmington, where they were waiting for me to fall in line again, to accept my place as an afterthought in their lives. Portland was where I could be whoever I wanted to be, whoever I had once been before I lost myself in the role of mother and grandmother. Portland was where I could start again. And as the cab drove through the quiet streets, I looked out the window at the city I once knew, at the city I was reclaiming, and I allowed myself to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. I settled into the small motel room just off the highway, my suitcase and the remnants of Harold's birthday meal tucked away in a bag on the bed. The room was simple, no frills, a bed, a chair, a television bolted to the wall. The air smelled faintly of stale carpet and cleaning products, the kind of scent that makes you realize how little the space has been lived in, how little it's been touched. I didn't mind it, though. It felt like a place where I could breathe, where I could figure out the next step without anyone looking over my shoulder, without anyone expecting anything from me. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to other people's needs, other people's demands. I wasn't answering the phone, filling the quiet with empty conversations, or watching the clock, waiting for someone to decide that I mattered again. For the first time in a long while, I was alone. But this time, it wasn't loneliness. It wasn't a void that consumed me. It was something else entirely. Something that felt strange, unsettling, but oddly freeing. I spent the first night in the motel just sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the walls, letting the stillness of it all sink in. The sounds of traffic outside were distant, muted by the thick window panes. I didn't sleep much, not at first. My mind kept wandering back to the moments before I left Wilmington. Daniel's coldness, Carla's dismissive smile, the empty look in my grandchildren's eyes. It was all so clear now, the way they had slowly drifted away, replaced by a new life, new priorities that didn't include me. In their world, I was an accessory, a distant relative whose presence could be tolerated only on occasion when it suited them. I couldn't blame them, not really. They had their own lives to live, their own families to care for. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being important. That first morning in Portland, I stood by the window, the same way I had in Wilmington, except now there were no familiar faces to look for, no errands to run, no phone calls to answer. The sky was overcast, the light dim and grey, but I felt it, the pull to something beyond this place, beyond the past. I didn't know what I was searching for. I didn't even know if I was looking for anything at all. But something inside me stirred, something quiet and certain, telling me that this moment, right here, right now, was mine. No one else's. By the time I made my way out to the street, the world around me felt unfamiliar, even though I had lived in Portland once. The streets were different now. Quieter, less bustling, but still full of life, of possibility. I walked for hours, my feet aching in the old shoes that had seen better days. But I didn't care. It felt good to move, to be. I found a little cafe down the road, tucked into a corner of the street, its windows fogged up with the warmth inside. It smelled of coffee and something sweet, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I walked in, ordered a coffee, and sat at a small table by the window, watching the world go by outside. The woman behind the counter was kind, polite, but didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. She simply handed me my coffee with a smile that felt real, not like the forced smiles I had received from Daniel and Carla over the years. There was no pity in her eyes, no hidden agenda. She was just a person, doing her job, living her life, and for a moment, I felt like I was part of it. The next few days passed in a blur of small tasks and simple pleasures. I found a room to rent from a woman named Joyce, who ran a small boarding house in a quiet part of the city. Her house smelled of lavender and old books, and though she was gruff and sharp-tongued, there was something in her demeanor that felt familiar, like someone who had seen enough of life to stop pretending it was easy. Joyce didn't ask me any questions either. She simply handed me the key to the room and let me be. It was a small room, modestly furnished, with a single bed, a dresser, and a desk by the window. The sunlight streamed through the glass in the morning, and the whole place felt like it belonged to someone else, but in the best way possible. I wasn't home, but I wasn't lost, either. I started to slip into a rhythm. I woke up early, went for walks around the neighborhood, and spent my afternoons reading or taking care of small errands. Joyce's house was a place of quiet, a place where no one expected anything from me. No one asked me about my past, about my family, or what had led me to this point. It didn't matter here. I wasn't a grandmother, a mother, or a daughter. I was just a woman, alone in a new city, and that was enough. But even in this small sanctuary, there were moments when the past came creeping back in. It was never loud, never demanding. It was just a quiet voice in the back of my mind, reminding me of the family I had left behind. One afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Kieran, my oldest grandchild, the one who used to visit me without being asked, the one who had spent hours with me in the garden, building birdhouses, painting them bright red. I hadn't heard from him in so long, and when I opened the letter, I saw the words that seemed to echo all the things I hadn't allowed myself to say. "Grandma, where are you?" It was short, just a few lines, but the weight of it hit me like a ton of bricks. "They're freaking out," he said. "Dad and Lisa. I'm checking every day to see if you're okay. Please let me know you're all right." He included a phone number. I stared at the letter for a long time, feeling the silence of it press in around me. I hadn't realized how much I missed him, how much I longed to hear his voice again, to know that there was still someone out there who cared about me. But I didn't call. Not then. I wasn't ready. Instead, I tucked the letter away in the drawer beside my bed, unopened, unread. I wasn't sure why I didn't call. Maybe it was because I wasn't ready to return to that world, to the family that had abandoned me, even if it was just by accident. Or maybe it was because I needed to know that I could survive without them, that I could make it on my own, without leaning on their approval, without waiting for their validation. And in that moment, I understood that the letter wasn't just from Kieran. It was from the past. It was the final tether, the last thing that was pulling me back to a life I had outgrown. I put the letter away, and I didn't look at it again. I went back to the kitchen to help Joyce with dinner, her gruff voice barking orders at me as I chopped vegetables. In that moment, as I stood there, surrounded by the smells of a simple, home-cooked meal, I realized that I wasn't ready to go back. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The weight of the past, of my family, of the life I had left behind, was still heavy in my chest. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to carry it. I wasn't running from it anymore. I wasn't hiding from it. I was simply learning how to live without it. The rhythm of my new life began to settle like dust on an untouched surface, quiet and even. Each morning brought with it the soft clink of dishes from Joyce's kitchen, the low purr of her cat Franklin as he rubbed against my calves, the faint hum of the radio playing old jazz standards that no one had updated in decades. There was something restorative in the repetition, in the absence of performance. I was no longer the version of myself that had been required for other people's comfort. The dependable grandmother, the self-effacing mother, the widow who never made a scene. In this place, in Joyce's crooked house with its creaky floors and windows that refused to close all the way, I was simply Martha. Not Mom, not Grandma, just Martha. And that, for the first time in as long as I could remember, was enough. Still, routines are a kind of disguise, too. They can mask a deeper stillness, one that might not be peace, but resignation. I knew I hadn't yet crossed into the place where my choices felt like freedom rather than defense. I hadn't yet earned the ease with which I moved through my days. I was still waiting for the next shift, the next internal change that would make all of this feel like a life instead of a pause. That shift began, quietly, with a "Help Wanted" sign. I saw it one morning on my walk, tucked behind the fingerprint-smeared glass of a small corner cafe not far from the house. The sign was handwritten, its corners curling from the damp air, and the words were simple. Morning shift. Apply inside. I stood in front of the window for a long moment, squinting through the reflection to glimpse the interior. 3 booths, a counter with red cushioned stools, and a young woman wiping down the coffee machine with a kind of absent-minded fatigue. I didn't plan to go in. I was too old, too out of practice, too something. But my feet betrayed my uncertainty, and before I knew it, I was inside, standing awkwardly at the entrance, the little bell above the door giving me away. The girl looked up, surprised, but didn't speak. I cleared my throat and asked, "You're hiring?" She nodded, called to the back, and from the kitchen emerged a woman in a messy bun with flour on her apron and a name tag that said, "Heather." She looked me up and down without expression and said, "You have experience?" I wanted to say no, not the kind you're asking about. But instead, I said, "I've raised 3 kids, run a household for 50 years, and I haven't been late to anything since 1964. There was a pause. Then she shrugged. "Trial shift tomorrow, 6 to 11. That night, I ironed my blouse, the one I had kept even after Carla suggested it was a little dated for brunch. I didn't tell Joyce where I was going, and she didn't ask. She watched me set out my clothes with the same quiet curiosity she applied to everything. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early. The man unlocking the door didn't ask who I was. He simply let me in and returned to his kitchen. Heather arrived last, clutching a travel mug and tossing me an apron without ceremony. "No perfume. Tie your hair back. Refill cups without waiting. Smile, but not too much." I nodded. By 7, the cafe was full. Contractors, nurses, older men who had nowhere else to be, but liked their coffee hot and their company minimal. I moved carefully at first, my hands unsure. But by 9, something in me clicked. I remembered how to carry plates without spilling, how to keep track of who ordered what, how to pour coffee with one hand while wiping counters with the other. Heather didn't praise me, but she didn't correct me either. And by the end of the shift, she handed me a towel and said, "Same time tomorrow?" In the weeks that followed, I found something in that work I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Not purpose, not yet, but motion, direction. A reason to get up, to move, to be somewhere at a certain time and be relied upon. My feet ached, my back complained, and the money was meager, but it was mine. My first paycheck was $74 and change, and I remember standing in the bank line holding that envelope like it contained a secret. When the teller asked how I wanted the cash, I said tens and fives, and I folded the bills slowly, deliberately, like they were pages in a story I hadn't finished yet. That afternoon, I walked into a second-hand shop I had passed a dozen times, but never entered. "Looking for something in particular?" the young woman behind the counter asked, and I said, "Something that makes me feel like myself again." She didn't blink. Just led me to a rack in the back, where I found a navy wool coat, herringbone pattern, deep pockets, warm. When I put it on, it fit like it had been waiting for me. I wore it home even though the air was still warm. Joyce whistled when she saw me. "Classy," she said. "Only on Fridays," I replied. The coat became a kind of armor, not because it was expensive or new, but because I had chosen it for no one but myself. For once, I hadn't asked permission. I hadn't sought approval. I had walked into a store, picked up something beautiful, and said, "Yes, this is mine." The feeling stayed with me for days. I walked differently in that coat, stood straighter, took deeper breaths. I wasn't healed, I wasn't whole, but I was walking towards something, and that mattered. A few days later, Heather called me into the back after my shift. "You're steady," she said. "Minimum wage plus tips. Weekday mornings. You want it?" I nodded. It wasn't a grand offer, but it was real, and real things were rare in my life. That afternoon, as I scrubbed down the counter and folded my apron, I caught sight of myself in the window's reflection. Not the woman I had been in Wilmington, not the grandmother waiting by the oven with Harold's picture on the table, but someone else. Someone new. Someone quiet but certain. I didn't know where this would lead. I didn't need to. I had stopped waiting for clarity. I had started walking. And that was enough. ChatGPT Skazal. Life was starting to feel like it was on the right track again, though I knew the calm, quiet of my existence could only last so long. There were still days when the weight of the past lingered heavily on me, when the loneliness crept back in like a shadow I couldn't shake off. Still, I had my work at the cafe, my routine with Joyce, and I'd even begun walking the neighborhood, familiarizing myself with the small parks, the local shops, the rhythm of the city that had once felt so foreign but was now becoming mine. Piece by piece. I had made peace with the fact that I was a woman alone, not by choice, but by necessity, and for the first time in years, that didn't scare me. It was just the way things were now. It wasn't easy, but I could breathe. But life, as it often does, finds a way to reach out, even when you think you've left it all behind. One rainy afternoon, as I wiped down the last of the tables after a busy lunch rush, I saw a familiar face through the cafe window. The tall, broad shoulders and greying hair stood out, even in the muted light of the overcast day. It was Adam, my son. I didn't need to see his face to know it was him. The way he carried himself, the stiff set of his jaw, the slight frown that always seemed to linger between his brows. It was unmistakable. He was standing on the sidewalk outside the cafe, looking through the window as though he wasn't sure if he should come in. For a moment, I stood frozen, the rag in my hands forgotten, my mind scrambling for what to do, how to respond. The past few weeks had been peaceful, and in a way, I had managed to forget that I was still tethered to a life I thought I had escaped. But there he was, and I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't pretend that this didn't matter. He glanced around, likely searching for me, and when his eyes met mine, I felt the air between us shift. There was no warmth in his gaze, no recognition of the woman he had once turned to for everything. No, this was the gaze of someone who was looking for answers, someone who didn't understand why things had fallen apart, someone who had spent far too many years pretending that nothing had changed. He was the same, but I was different, and for the first time in a long time, I realized I wasn't going to go back to the version of myself that had spent her life bending to his will, always hoping he'd notice, always waiting for his approval. That version of me was dead. I didn't know why he was here, why he had come after all this time. Perhaps it was guilt, or maybe it was just the realization that things weren't as simple as he had thought. The family vacation, the one he had insisted I stay behind from, had been the last straw. I had been left behind like a forgotten suitcase, left alone in the lounge while they took off for Honolulu without a second thought. It was the kind of thing that stung at first, but with each passing day, it became clearer to me that it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. They didn't want me there. They had moved on, and in doing so, they had erased me from the story of their lives. I continued to watch him, unsure of how to proceed. He hadn't entered the cafe, and I didn't move toward him. I didn't know if I wanted him to come in, to break the silence that had settled between us. There had been no phone calls, no messages, nothing since I had left Wilmington. Adam had simply accepted that I was gone, and maybe he had been relieved by that. But today, he stood there, his hand on the door handle, hesitating, as if he didn't know how to begin, as if he thought that maybe, just maybe, I would be waiting for him to fix things, to apologize, to make it all right again. But I wasn't waiting for him anymore. I felt the familiar twinge of anger rise up in me, the same anger I had felt the night they left me behind at the airport, the same anger I had buried deep inside for so many years. But it was different now. I wasn't angry for the sake of holding on to hurt. I wasn't angry to punish him or to make him feel what I had felt. I was angry because I had allowed this to go on for so long. I had allowed myself to be invisible, to be forgotten, to be treated as if I was a mere inconvenience in their lives. And now, here he was, standing outside, unsure of whether he should face the consequences of his actions. But the thing was, I wasn't the one who needed to face anything anymore. He was. Finally, Adam opened the door, the little bell above it chiming softly as he stepped inside. He looked around the cafe, his eyes scanning the room for me, and when he saw me behind the counter, he hesitated for just a second before making his way toward me. He didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, waiting for me to say something, to make this easier. But I wasn't going to make it easy. I wasn't going to be the one to patch things up, to pretend that nothing had happened, to go back to the way things used to be. I wasn't going to pretend that I hadn't seen the truth in his eyes when he left me behind. That was the last straw for me. I had finally realized that I wasn't worth the effort, not in his eyes. And if I wasn't worth it to him, I wasn't worth it to myself either. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice quiet but steady. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't anything except calm, like someone who had finally accepted that they couldn't change what had already been done. Adam blinked at me, his lips tightening. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand to stop him. "I know why you're here," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet of the cafe. I know why you've come, but I'm not going to do this with you anymore, Adam. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I don't see what you did. I'm not going to let you rewrite the story to make yourself feel better." His face went pale, his hand dropping to his side as he stared at me, unblinking. The shock in his eyes was enough to make me pause for a moment, to wonder if maybe I had been too harsh. But then I remembered the months of waiting, the years of giving, and how, in the end, I had always been the one to wait for something that never came. The apology, the recognition, the love I had so desperately wanted. It hadn't come, and it wasn't going to come now. "You left me at the airport," I said, my voice a little louder this time. "You left me there, alone, not by accident. You did it on purpose. I'm not going to pretend that I didn't see it for what it was. You don't get to come back into my life and act like everything is fine. It's not fine." Adam took a step back, his face falling, but I didn't soften. I didn't move to comfort him. That was the old me, the one who had always been there to pick up the pieces when he broke something. But I wasn't going to fix this. Not anymore. "I don't want an apology," I said, my words cutting through the silence. "I don't want to hear how sorry you are, because it's too late for that. What I want is for you to understand that you don't get to erase me from your life and expect me to just come back. I'm not your backup anymore, Adam. I'm not the one who's going to clean up your messes. I'm done." The air between us grew thick, but neither of us spoke. For a long time I stood there, watching him, not out of anger, but out of a strange sense of closure. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment where I finally stood up for myself, for the woman I had been and the woman I had become. Adam turned to leave, and as he did, I felt the weight in my chest lift, just a little. The door closed behind him, and I was left in the quiet of the cafe, the bell ringing softly in the silence. I didn't feel relieved, or even proud. I felt something else, something deeper. I felt like I had finally chosen myself, and that, I realized, was the only choice that had ever mattered. The days that followed Adam's unexpected visit were quieter than I had anticipated. The cafe was busier than usual, and I found myself losing myself in the rhythm of the work, filling coffee cups, wiping down counters, taking orders from people who were polite but didn't look too closely. It was the kind of busy that demanded attention but didn't ask for more than what you were willing to give. I had told Adam what I needed to say, and now I just needed to move forward, not look back. I hadn't expected closure, but I had expected something, a shift inside of me that would allow me to finally step into the life I had started to rebuild. I didn't expect it to come in the form of a letter. I had stopped checking my phone a few weeks ago, convinced that nothing I saw there could change anything. I wasn't interested in hearing from Adam, nor was I interested in seeing any of the empty apologies or manipulations that often accompanied his messages. But Joyce, being Joyce, wasn't one to leave well enough alone. One afternoon, as I wiped the tables down after the lunch rush, she handed me an envelope, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me. "This came for you," she said, tossing it on the counter. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Adams, scrawled in his hurried, almost indecipherable script. For a moment, I just stared at the envelope. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to read another empty apology, another attempt at fixing things that couldn't be fixed. But there was something in the way Joyce had looked at me when she handed it to me, something that made me realize I had been holding my breath, waiting for a sign that I was truly done, that I could move on without ever looking back. And maybe, just maybe, this letter would be that sign. So I opened it, slowly, deliberately, letting each fold of the paper fall into place before I read the words. It was a letter that tried to be everything all at once: apologetic, defensive, remorseful, and ultimately full of nothing. He started with the usual rehearsed lines, the ones I'd heard before when he didn't know how to face what he had done. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I never meant to hurt you." The words were hollow, almost empty, and I couldn't help but feel the familiar sting of disappointment as I read on. "I miss you, Mom. The kids miss you. You're still family." I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to piece things back together in a way that made him feel better, to rewrite the narrative so that he wasn't the one who had abandoned me. He wanted me to believe that everything could go back to the way it was before, that I could forgive him, that I could erase the years of neglect, the years of silence, and that I could just slide back into the role I had once played in his life. But that wasn't going to happen. He asked me to call him. He even included a new number, one I was certain wasn't for a quick check-in, but rather another attempt to reel me back in, to reclaim his hold on me. I put the letter down without reading any further. I had heard enough. And this time, I wasn't going to play along. I wasn't going to pretend that I hadn't seen the truth that had been sitting in plain sight all along, the truth that Adam didn't need me, that his life had moved on, and that I had to stop waiting for him to make room for me in it. I had to make my own room. And that was what this letter had confirmed. It was the final piece of the puzzle I had been putting together all this time. I wasn't going to go back. I wasn't going to answer. I wasn't going to let him rewrite the past. I stood up and folded the letter in half. As I did, I realized that the decision I had made in that moment wasn't just about rejecting Adam or his letter. It was about rejecting the version of myself that had allowed this to go on for so long, the version that had allowed herself to be invisible for the sake of keeping the peace, the version that had waited for things to change instead of changing them herself. And in that realization, something shifted inside me. Something clicked deep in the core of who I was. I was finally ready to let go. That night, I went home to Joyce's house and sat in the quiet of my room, the letter still folded in my pocket. It had been a long day at the cafe, and I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this tiny shift, was bigger than anything I had experienced in years. I wasn't angry at Adam anymore. I wasn't even sad. I was just done. It wasn't a feeling of closure or resolution. It was a feeling of something more profound, a quiet, unspoken understanding that I didn't need to keep carrying the weight of this relationship anymore. That weight was not mine to bear. It had never been. I went to the kitchen, where Joyce was sitting at the table, sipping her tea, the familiar smell of garlic and onions drifting from the stove. She didn't ask me about the letter, didn't ask me how I was feeling. She just sat there, calm, steady, like she always did. I sat down across from her, my hands resting in my lap, and I looked at her. "I'm done with it," I said quietly. Joyce didn't respond immediately. She just nodded once, as if she had already known this was coming. She had seen it before, the way people clung to the past, the way they let it poison their future, until one day they just let go. After a long silence, she looked up at me. "You know what you have to do, right?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over me like a blanket. "Yeah?" I said. "I know." The next day, I took the letter and walked to the small fire pit in the backyard, the one Joyce used to burn leaves in the fall. The day was grey and chilly, the air filled with the scent of wet earth. I stared at the letter for a long time before I lit a match. The fire crackled, the letter curling at the edges as the flames consumed it. I watched it burn, the smoke rising into the sky, and I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel anger. I just felt empty. Empty, but not in a bad way. Empty, like a space that had been cleared out, ready for something new. Later that afternoon, I sat on the porch with Joyce, the fire still smouldering behind us. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had made a decision that was entirely mine. A decision that was irrevocable. And for once, I didn't feel the need to look back. That night, as I sat in my room, I thought about all that had led me here. How far I had come from that airport lounge, from the woman who had waited and waited for a family that never came back for her. I thought about the strength I had found in myself, about the life I was finally beginning to rebuild. It wasn't a grand life. It wasn't the life I had once imagined. But it was my life, and for the first time in years, I could look at it without regret. I was free, and that was enough. The next morning, I went to the cafe, ready for another shift, another day. The apron felt familiar now, like something I had worn all my life. As I stood behind the counter, pouring coffee for a regular customer, I saw a man standing outside, looking in. It was Arthur, the older gentleman who had been coming in for weeks now. He had become a quiet fixture in my life, someone who didn't ask questions, didn't expect anything from me, but who seemed to understand more than anyone else. He gave me a small wave through the window, and I smiled, knowing that he saw me for who I was now, not who I had been. I went outside during my break, and Arthur joined me on the bench. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside me, watching the world go by. After a while, he turned to me and asked, "How's it going?" His voice was warm, steady, like the earth beneath my feet. "It's going," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I needed anything else. The days that followed Adam's letter burned away quietly, as all things do once they are truly finished. I didn't feel the immediate rush of freedom or triumph that I'd expected. I didn't feel any dramatic release. Instead, there was something softer, a steady, ongoing relief that filled the corners of my life like the warmth of the sun creeping through a window, unnoticed but steady. The air felt lighter, and the world outside seemed to have grown a little more open, as if the decision I had made to close one chapter had somehow allowed new possibilities to slip in, unnoticed at first, but slowly becoming more familiar, more comfortable as time passed. Joyce never pressed me for details about Adam's visit, nor did she ask me to explain how I was feeling. She didn't need to. She had always been the kind of woman who let you come to your own realizations, who understood that some things couldn't be rushed or solved with words. Instead, she kept her own quiet watch over me, offering me the space to breathe and the occasional word of advice when I least expected it. It was enough. And though she wasn't the kind of woman who offered affection in the form of grand gestures or displays, there was something about her presence that felt like home, something that had begun to fill the hollow place I had carried with me for so long. The cafe continued to be my anchor, and with each passing day, it became less a place I went to out of necessity, and more a place that felt like a rhythm I had found, a rhythm that belonged to me. The regulars, who came in every morning, started to feel like a second family, the kind of family you choose for yourself, the kind that accepts you without expectation, without any need to prove yourself. Arthur, the older man who always sat in the corner booth with his black coffee and his newspapers, became more than just a fixture in my life. He started to engage me in quiet conversation between refills, sharing little tidbits of his life, his history, his thoughts on the world around us. His words were soft, but there was a wisdom in them that soothed me. It wasn't that I was searching for something in him. It was just that his company was the kind of quiet reassurance I had begun to crave, the kind of companionship that didn't demand anything of me except the willingness to be present. It was on one of those afternoons when the rain had been pouring relentlessly, the kind of heavy rain that fills the streets with a sense of quiet and solitude, that I found myself sitting down beside him, a cup of tea in my hands, a plate of cookies I had baked the night before sitting in front of us. We hadn't talked much that day, but something had shifted. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else entirely, something familiar. And after a while, I realized that I didn't need words from him. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need validation. I just needed to be. Arthur was the first person in a long time who hadn't tried to fill the silence with words, who had simply let it exist between us. And in that space, I began to feel a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. Not the kind of peace that comes from running away or from closing a door, but the peace that comes when you've made the hard choices, when you've accepted that the past is done and the future is something you will create on your own terms. A week later, I was standing behind the counter at the cafe when a familiar voice called out my name. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Kieran, my grandson. The sight of him was enough to stop me in my tracks. I hadn't seen him in over a year, not since that day when I had left Wilmington. I had expected to hear from him. He had written me once or twice, asking how I was, checking in, but I hadn't expected him to show up, not like this. Not without warning, not like the whirlwind of emotion that I could feel swelling inside me. I tried not to let my surprise show, tried to keep my expression neutral, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He was still the same boy I remembered, the one who had always found joy in the small things, who had loved to help me with whatever project I was working on. But now, he was a young man, and the passage of time had changed us both in ways I hadn't expected. He stepped into the cafe, his eyes scanning the room, and then he saw me. A flicker of recognition passed between us, followed by an awkward smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I couldn't blame him for the hesitation. After everything that had happened, everything that had been left unsaid, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't a child anymore, and I wasn't the same grandmother he remembered. "Grandma," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. I didn't know what to say at first. I wasn't sure what he wanted from me, what he thought this would be, but there was something in his face, something in the way he looked at me, that made me realize that he was here for something more than just a casual visit. He wasn't here to pretend that everything was fine, to offer me empty words or shallow gestures. No, he was here because he knew something had been left unfinished between us. "Hey, Kieran," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "How have you been?" He smiled a little, but it wasn't a smile of certainty. It was the smile of someone who wasn't quite sure where they stood anymore. He stepped closer, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. "I've been all right. You know, life, school, work. You know how it is." He paused, glancing around the cafe before his eyes returned to me. "I've missed you. We all have." I couldn't bring myself to say anything at first. His words, simple and familiar, hit me like a wave. I had missed him too, but the weight of everything that had happened between us made it difficult to know how to respond. "I'm sorry for not keeping in touch more," he continued. "I don't know why I didn't. I think I was scared." Not scared of you, but scared of what I might find, you know? I didn't want to find out that we'd lost everything. That you were gone. His words struck me in a way that I hadn't anticipated. I had expected anger, disappointment, maybe even resentment. But what he gave me was something different. It was vulnerability, the kind of vulnerability that only comes when you've lived through something painful and come out the other side, not quite sure who you are anymore. I took a deep breath, the weight of his words settling on me. We didn't lose everything, I said softly, but we did lose a lot of time. I lost a lot of time thinking that things could just go back to the way they were, but they can't. And that's okay. It's just how it is now. He nodded, his expression a mix of understanding and regret. There was no magic solution, no instant reconciliation. There was just the quiet reality that we had both been through something and that perhaps we could begin again. Slowly, carefully, but we could begin. "Do you want some coffee?" I asked, my voice steady. "I've got a fresh pot brewing." He nodded, and I led him to a booth by the window, where we sat in silence for a few minutes, just the two of us. I could hear the sounds of the cafe around us, laughter, conversation, the clinking of mugs. But in that moment, the noise faded away, and I was reminded of how it felt to be with him, to be part of something that was still growing, still evolving. Over the next few weeks, Kieran came by often. We didn't talk about the past, not in the way I had expected. Instead, we talked about his life, his future, the things he was passionate about. We talked about how much had changed and how little it had. And in those small conversations, I found myself beginning to heal, not from the wounds Adam had left behind, but from the wounds I had inflicted on myself by not letting go sooner. One evening, as we sat together in the cafe, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm glad you're here, Grandma," he said, his voice softer than I had ever heard it. "I'm glad you didn't give up on us." I squeezed his hand, the weight of his words sitting with me like the comfort of a warm blanket. I didn't need to answer him. The answer was in the quiet moments, in the way we had found our way back to each other, piece by piece, without rushing, without trying to fix everything all at once. We had found a way to exist in the same space again, and that was enough. And as the days stretched on, as the seasons slowly changed, I realized something I hadn't known before, that closure wasn't a thing you could wait for. It wasn't a letter or a phone call or an apology. It was something you created for yourself. It was something you earned through the hard work of rebuilding, through the quiet moments of letting go, and through the understanding that sometimes the best thing you can do is simply choose to live. And in choosing to live, I had finally chosen myself. And for the first time in years, that was enough.